Welcome to Old Heart Stories. The light in San Francisco that autumn of 1895 held a peculiar, sulphurous quality. It was the sharp, yellow light of late afternoon, filtered not through the usual Pacific fog, but through the ever-present haze of ash and pulverized stone that hung like a mournful veil over the city's bones. The great quake had passed months ago, but the work of demolition and the subsequent fires had left gaping wounds, and in those wounds Clara found her purpose. She was not documenting resilience, not yet. Clara was documenting loss. Her breath plumed white in the cooling air as she wrestled with the heavy mechanism of her large-format wooden camera. It was an awkward, glorious burden strapped to the tripod, its brass fixtures gleaming dully against the backdrop of wreckage. Clara, draped in the practical dark wool required of a working widow, stood in what had been the heart of the old Spanish Quarter, now reduced to staggered facades and mounds of rubble that smelled perpetually of ozone and wet plaster. She needed this light, the final melancholic wash before dusk, to capture the face of the old Larkin Library, a face that, by the morrow, might be entirely gone. Clara slid the glass plate holder carefully into the camera back, her gloved fingers precise and practiced. The library's remains were striking, a magnificent arch of granite, cracked vertically down the center, the surrounding wall having peeled away like dry skin to expose the skeletal structure beneath. It was tragic, beautiful evidence of time's cruelty and the fragility of human endeavor. If you are waiting for it to simply dissolve into history, Mrs. Shaw, I assure you, you will be waiting past dinner. The voice was low, resonant, and clipped with the certainty of a man who dealt in angles and iron, not poetry. It was a voice Clara had come to despise on principle, and yet one that never failed to send a jarring shiver down her spine. Clara did not turn immediately. She pulled the dark velvet cloth over her head, plunging herself into the solitary, inverted world of the ground glass. The arch appeared upside down, sharp and clear. "Mr. Hayes," she murmured, her voice muffled, "I was under the impression that this specific lot was not slated for clearing until the city assessor verified the structural integrity of the north-facing wall." "It was slated," Benjamin Hayes replied, closer now, the crisp, expensive scent of starched linen and bay rum cutting through the dusty air. "I spent the entire morning proving there is no structural integrity to verify. It is a hazard, Mrs. Shaw, a magnificent, crumbling hazard." Clara emerged from beneath the cloth, shaking her head slightly, her gaze sharp. Benjamin Hayes stood perhaps 10 feet away, a stark figure of modernity amidst the decay. Where Clara wore practical, dust-smeared wool, he wore a tailored three-piece suit of charcoal worsted, somehow managing to look clean and authoritative even when surrounded by grit. He carried a heavy roll of blueprints tied with white twine in one hand, and a measuring stick was tucked under his arm. He looked less like a man ready to build, and more like a general ready to conquer. "Hazard," Clara repeated, adjusting the focus ring, "or history, Mr. Hayes. I have spent 3 days waiting for this exact light to capture this exact fracture line. It tells a story that your steel girders will erase forever." Benjamin sighed, a sound of deeply controlled impatience. He was a man defined by efficiency, and Clara, in her pursuit of memorializing the past, was a profound inefficiency. "I am contracted to give San Francisco a future, Mrs. Shaw, not mourn its past. That facade is slate, not granite, and the mortar has turned to dust. If you delay the rigging of the shoring beams any longer, the next strong wind will turn your artistic endeavor into a liability suit." "My endeavor is the only true record this city will possess of what was lost," Clara countered, stepping possessively closer to the tripod. "You speak of rebuilding, but your blueprints are deaf to the whispers of the past. You tear down what is authentic to build what is merely convenient." Benjamin tucked the blueprints under his arm and walked slowly toward her, crossing the broken pavement until the toe of his polished boot was inches from a stray piece of carved slate she had intended to photograph later. He was tall, powerfully built beneath the fine fabric, and his presence always felt like the arrival of a sudden warm front, intense and slightly overwhelming. "And you, Mrs. Shaw, would have us live in a museum, surrounded by precarious relics, suffocating under the weight of memory while the rest of the world speeds toward the 20th century? Convenience is progress. Authentic is broken." His eyes, a cool, decisive shade of hazel, held hers, and for a fraught second, the raw energy of their opposition filled the space between them, a tension thick enough to be cut by a wire saw. It was infuriating. Every time they met, whether over a salvaged doorframe or a disputed property line, he managed to reduce her solemn work to frivolous sentimentality. "Do you ever slow down, Mr. Hayes?" Clara challenged, dropping her voice to a low, intense register. "Or are you so frightened of the empty spaces that you must fill them instantly with steel and glass?" A faint flicker crossed his expression, something sharp and almost vulnerable, before it was instantly masked by professional detachment. "I am simply aware of the ticking clock, Mrs. Shaw. Unlike your chemical plates, my schedule does not allow for long exposures." He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to her gloved hand resting on the camera's focusing rail. "Now, if you are quite finished with your artistic memorial to substandard 1850s construction, I must ask you to move your equipment. The crew is ready to work." Clara knew she was beaten for the day. He held the contracts, the permits, and the undeniable force of the city's future commission behind him. She was simply a photographer, clinging to the ghosts. "Very well," she said coolly, beginning the slow, careful process of dismantling her equipment. The plates were precious, the camera delicate. She moved deliberately slowly, forcing him to wait, a small, passive resistance against his relentless haste. Benjamin stood watching her, and Clara could feel the focus of his gaze. It was sharp, analytical, lingering longer than necessary on the curve of her profile as she adjusted the tripod legs. It was the same intense observation he applied to a load-bearing wall, assessing its weaknesses and its surprising strengths. As she detached the cumbersome wooden camera box, her elbow brushed against the lens marrow, causing a slight tremble. Before she could steady it, Benjamin's hand shot out, catching the edge of the tripod base just as it threatened to wobble. The contact was fleeting, purely functional, yet electric. His hand was large, tailored for precision, warm from activity. Clara snatched her elbow back, her heart hammering a rapid beat that had nothing to do with the precarious balance of the equipment. "Thank you," she managed, her voice tight. "A necessary structural intervention," he replied, his tone entirely dry, entirely impersonal, though his eyes seemed to hold a fleeting warmth that contradicted the professionalism. He stepped back, restoring the necessary distance between them, and unrolled his blueprints with a decisive snap. Clara focused furiously on her work, packing the camera into its case. She knew the tension that coiled between them was not merely professional disagreement. It was the friction of two opposing, powerful forces trapped in the same broken landscape. Every sharp word, every frustrating encounter seemed to pull them closer to a precipice, a recognition that went deeper than their mutual irritation. "I assume, Mr. Hayes," Clara said, hoisting the heavy tripod onto her shoulder, "that the cornerstone of the Larkin Library, which holds the original 1857 dedication scroll, will be carefully preserved for the city archives?" Benjamin glanced down at the enormous, crumbling block of stone half buried in the dust near his feet. "If it doesn't slow down the steam shovel, Mrs. Shaw, I'll send a man to check for your scroll." He said it dismissively, as though he were promising to clear a patch of weeds. "Do more than check, Mr. Hayes," Clara warned, leveling a look at him that promised retribution if the scroll were destroyed. "That is the foundational memory of this neighborhood. Do not confuse the destruction of a building with the erasure of its soul." He merely nodded, his attention already absorbed by the complex lines on his paper. "I will note your sentimental requirement, Mrs. Shaw. Now, if you will kindly exit the active construction zone." Clara turned without another word, her cheeks flushed with frustration and something else she refused to name. She walked away from the rising dust and the impatient crew, the heavy weight of her camera equipment strangely comforting. Benjamin Hayes was arrogance personified, the cold, calculated face of the future. Yet, as she reached the corner, she risked one last glance back. Benjamin was still standing there, his head bent over the plans. Then he straightened, stepping over the piles of rubble, not toward his crew, but toward the dusty, discarded cornerstone. He bent down, brushing the debris away from the etched date, 1857, with the edge of his immaculate glove. He paused, looking at the stone for a long moment, before signaling sharply to one of his foremen. A small tremor of confused satisfaction ran through Clara. Perhaps the architect of progress was not entirely immune to the ghosts of the past after all. She clutched her plate holders tight, knowing that their arguments were far from over, and knowing, too, that the fire they ignited between them burned hotter than the ash that covered San Francisco. The air above Mission Street was thick with the scent of wet ash and freshly sawed redwood. Clara had lingered too long, unable to shake the image of Benjamin Hayes studying the old cornerstone, as if it held a secret language he was compelled to decipher. She knew the cornerstone was the key, the foundation was the lie. She did not return to her studio. Instead, she followed the intuition that whispered to her through the ruins. She found Benjamin not among his crew, but kneeling in the excavated pit where the old library's foundation had been exposed. He was holding a narrow silver trowel, usually reserved for ornamental plasterwork, scraping diligently at the mortar beside the great stone. "Hayes," she called, her voice sharp with sudden anxiety. "What are you doing? That is highly unstable." He didn't look up immediately. "I am investigating the structural anomaly you so diligently photographed, Mrs. Shaw. You noted an inconsistent mortar mix beneath the primary block. I concur." His admission, devoid of professional condescension, struck her silent. She scrambled down the slope of broken brick, dropping to her knees beside him. The last rays of the San Francisco sun, bruised and orange, caught the glint of metal within the gap. "It is a strong box," Clara whispered, reaching out a dusty glove. Benjamin stopped her with a touch far firmer than the situation warranted. "No, it is a concealment. And judging by the precision required to place it, this was never meant to be found by routine demolition." The silence stretched, broken only by the distant clatter of a mule-drawn wagon. They worked together now, a strange, silent partnership forged in the dirt. He carefully levering the heavy block, she bracing the unstable surrounding material. Finally, with a grinding protest of stone against stone, the small cavity was revealed. It wasn't a silver box, but a scroll, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, tied with a brittle, faded blue ribbon. Benjamin handled it with an unexpected gentleness. As his fingers began to unroll the yellowed parchment, a shadow fell over the pit, sudden and cold. "Mr. Hayes," a familiar, oily voice drawled. It was Mr. Sterling, the representative from the Consolidated Land Trust, the primary force pushing for immediate total demolition. Behind him stood two burly foremen, not of Benjamin's regular crew. "I was told the cornerstone area was secured. Why are you interfering with the demolition schedule?" Benjamin slowly rose, the scroll held securely in his left hand. "I am investigating a discrepancy in the original deed, Sterling. This documentation, dating back to 1857, indicates this specific land parcel was designated as protected communal property in perpetuity. Sterling's carefully cultivated veneer of polite contempt evaporated. His eyes fixed on the scroll with pure, desperate malice. That document is a forgery, a piece of sentimental rubbish. Give it to me, Hayes. We have a timeline to meet. This is the original decree, Sterling. It proves the trust's acquisition of this land through deceptive means, as they failed to honor the original foundation's purpose. Any further demolition here is illegal. This neighborhood is protected. Benjamin held the parchment high, using his tall frame as a shield. "You arrogant fool," Sterling lunged, a terrible noise ripping from his throat. "You choose history over a fortune, over the future?" The foreman rushed the pit. Clara reacted instantaneously, not reaching for the scroll, but for her camera bag. She scrambled back against the damp brick, pulling out the largest plate holder, readying the lens. "Benjamin, move!" she yelled, the warning choked off by the force of the foreman's descent. Benjamin did not move. He stood fast, protecting the evidence, turning his body toward the attack. One of the men grabbed his shoulder, attempting to wrestle the document away. Benjamin, the architect of ordered progress, moved with a sudden, devastating fury, twisting away from the grip and delivering a sharp blow that sent the man reeling backward into the rubble. But the moment of distraction was enough for Sterling. He seized a heavy, rusted pipe from the ground and swung it, not at Benjamin, but directly at the scroll. "It ends now!" Sterling screamed. Clara heard the whistle of air, saw the flash of metal, and knew that Benjamin was too slow to block it. Without hesitation, she stepped out from the shadows of the wall, placing herself directly between the blow and the scroll, her camera raised to capture the moment of the crime. "No!" she cried. The pipe struck the reinforced tripod she held, the sound deafening, jarring her to the bone. The heavy glass-plated camera shattered, exploding in a shower of fractured glass and splintered wood. Sterling froze, shocked by her audacious interference, while Benjamin, having seen the sacrifice of her primary tool, acted. He slammed the scroll into Clara's chest, and then, with a primal roar that defied his polished exterior, tackled Sterling into the dusty ground. The fight was brief. The sound of the shattering glass and Benjamin's raw aggression drew the attention of his loyal foreman, who rushed over to subdue Sterling and the remaining thugs. It was over. The scroll was safe. The neighborhood was protected. Clara sank against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs, the shards of her camera glistening like tears in the dust around her feet. The oilcloth roll felt heavy and vital in her hands. Benjamin was instantly beside her, ignoring the struggling men being restrained nearby. He checked her arms, her head, his hands clumsy with shock and fear. "Clara, are you hurt? Did that monster, did he touch you?" His voice was raw, stripped of every layer of professional cool. "I am fine," she managed, pushing his hands away gently. She looked at the wreckage of her camera, the beautiful, irreplaceable instrument that had documented the city's pain and promise. A profound sadness settled over her. "My camera, Benjamin, it saved the scroll." He looked down at the mess of brass and dark glass, then back at her face, his gaze intense, searching. His immaculate glove was torn, dirt streaked his sharp jawline, and his breath hitched unevenly. "The camera is only a tool, Clara," he murmured, kneeling closer. You stepped into the swing of that pipe, for a piece of parchment, for an idea. For the soul of this place," she corrected, her voice trembling slightly. "For the truth you were too stubborn to acknowledge." He didn't argue. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing the line of grit near her temple. The touch was electrical, a spark far hotter than the arguments they usually exchanged. It was a declaration, not of war, but of absolute surrender. I was not too stubborn to acknowledge it, he admitted, his voice dropping to a husky whisper meant only for her. I was too afraid to acknowledge that your passion, your dedication to the past, was necessary. It is the only thing that gives structure meaning. He leaned closer, his eyes dark with the realization that had just nearly cost them everything. I came here to build a future, Clara, with steel and stone. I found that the future cannot stand without its foundation, and that foundation is you. You fight for the very integrity I preach. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the sharp lines of his face. She felt the fierce protective energy radiating from him, melting away the years of guarded frustration and loneliness. The animosity had been a shield, thin and easily broken, concealing the deep, undeniable alignment of their spirits. "And you," she whispered, leaning into his touch, "you are not merely a man of blueprints, Benjamin Hayes. You are a man who stood for integrity when the easier path was ruin. You risked your future for my history." The distance between them, measured in architectural drawings and photographic plates, vanished. He lowered his head, his lips finding hers with a gentle, searching desperation, tasting of dust and the metallic hint of blood from his torn hand. It was not a kiss of professional respect, nor was it the tentative exploration of strangers. It was the kiss of two halves finding their whole in the face of chaos, sealing a promise made between the rubble and the sky. When he finally drew back, his forehead rested against hers. The scroll was still pressed between them, a tangible proof of their collaboration. "What will we do now?" she asked, the practical reality of the conspiracy's fallout settling in. He took a deep, steadying breath, his hands settling firmly on her shoulders, grounding her. "We will document this. We will ensure Sterling and the trust face the consequences," Benjamin said, his voice regaining some of its formal strength, but infused now with profound personal commitment. "And then, Clara Shaw, we will rebuild this city. We will build it together. I will provide the compass, and you will provide the light." He looked at the broken camera lying nearby, then back into her eyes. "I will buy you a dozen new cameras. But first, let us save the soul of San Francisco." The 6 months that followed were not gentle, but they were truthful. The scandal surrounding the Sterling Development Trust unfolded slowly, like a damp curtain refusing to draw back fully, yet revealing enough sordid detail to halt their destructive progress. Benjamin, though risking professional exile by betraying his former colleagues, had secured his future by choosing integrity. The documents, paired with Clara's exhaustive photographs, the shadows, the faces of displacement, the fragile beauty of the buildings they were meant to destroy, were incontrovertible. Sterling resigned, the trust dissolved, and the historic district was saved, enshrined under a newly formed preservation committee Benjamin himself helped draft the charter for. He had kept his promise. He had bought her not 1, but 3 new cameras, including a magnificent 8x10 view camera imported from Germany, its bellows of rich, supple leather, its lens sharp and unforgivingly clear. They established their offices not in the towering financial district where Benjamin had once spent his days sketching glass and steel futures, but in a sturdy, charmingly angled brick building near the waterfront, a place Benjamin argued was structurally sound, and Clara countered was possessed of a magnificent eastward-facing light. The space was a beautiful contradiction. One wall was dedicated to Benjamin's drafting table, meticulously ordered tools laid out beside precise calculations etched in pencil. The opposite wall was Clara's darkroom and storage area, smelling faintly of fixer and humid paper, littered with contact sheets in the chaotic sprawl of visual narratives. Their partnership became known across the city, an improbable and highly successful alliance. Benjamin Hayes, the architect who listened, designed structures that embraced the modernity San Francisco demanded, steel reinforcement and efficient spacing, but they whispered of the past, incorporating salvaged redwood, preserving ornate cornices, and prioritizing pedestrian beauty over sheer vehicular volume. And Clara Shaw, the photographer who remembered, documented every phase. She didn't merely take pictures of the completed buildings, she captured the process. The hand of the stonemason, the dust rising from the freshly milled lumber, the focused intensity in Benjamin's eyes as he checked a foundation block. She didn't just document history, she documented the careful, deliberate act of building an honorable future. They still fought, of course, but the skirmishes were now collaborative, passionate debates that ended not in slammed doors, but in shared laughter over lukewarm coffee. "The pitch of that roof is aesthetically pleasing, yes, Clara, but it is terribly inefficient for runoff in our winter fog," he would argue, leaning over the blueprint, his finger tracing a line with exasperated affection. "The efficiency of the roof matters little if the spirit of the structure is dead, Benjamin," she would counter, holding up a framed print of the original building for comparison. "A building must breathe, darling. It must recall the light of those who built it the first time." Darling had slipped into their vocabulary months ago, emerging during a late night over the complicated specifications of a municipal library restoration. It had startled them both, a tiny, warm secret exchanged over a cold drawing table, and now it was simply a truth of their conversation. Their own future solidified as logically and beautifully as one of Benjamin's cantilever designs. He proposed not with a ring, though that came later, a subtle band of hammered gold reflecting the light, but with the deed to a small two-story house on Russian Hill, one they had spent weeks restoring with meticulous devotion. It was on a foggy Sunday afternoon, the city muffled beneath a soft gray blanket. They stood in the empty parlor, the scent of fresh paint and new oak heavy in the air. The space was ready for furniture, ready for life. "This is built to last," Benjamin murmured, turning her to face him, his hands resting heavily on her waist. His eyes, once so intensely focused on the future only, now held the settled warmth of a man who had found his present. No hidden agreements, no faulty foundations. Everything is exposed. Everything is honest. Clara leaned her head back against his shoulder, looking up at the high, carved ceiling. "It is perfect, Benjamin. You have managed to build a house that feels old and yet is utterly new." "It is a compass and a light, my love," he corrected, his lips brushing the curve of her ear. "The structure is my compass, pointing us toward stability. But the warmth, the memory, the intention, that is all the light you brought into my life. I was only drafting lines on paper before I met you. You taught me that structure without soul is merely expensive debris." She turned in his arms, her fingers tracing the healed scar tissue on his palm, the reminder of the chaos they had faced together. "And you, Benjamin," she whispered, "you taught me that memory without movement becomes stagnation. You pushed me past the grief of what was lost, showing me that the best way to honor the past is to ensure its essence survives in the future." The silence that followed was full of unspoken understanding. The memory of her late husband, the ghosts of the old San Francisco, the raw, difficult process of merging two seemingly opposite lives into one cohesive design. Their love had been forged in the white-hot intensity of conflict and conspiracy, yet it had settled into a quiet, profound certainty. A year after the trust's collapse, they stood together on the wide veranda of their home. The evening fog had parted, revealing a vast, glittering expanse of the city below them. New lights bloomed in the distance, electric marvels that shone alongside the soft, familiar glow of gas lamps. Clara held her newest camera, adjusting the aperture, ready to capture the twilight vista. Beside her, Benjamin had a roll of blueprints tucked loosely under his arm, preliminary sketches for a grand new opera house, blending Romanesque arches with modern acoustics. "Look, Benjamin," Clara said softly, lowering the camera. "It is truly magnificent now, rebuilt, restored, defiant." He put his arm around her, pulling her close, resting his chin on the crown of her head. He inhaled the familiar scent of chemicals and jasmine that clung to her clothes. "We did well, my photographer," he murmured. "We built something stronger than steel and clearer than any lens." He looked out over the city they had fought for. The ruins were gone, replaced by permanence, by hope, and by the tangible evidence of their shared endeavor. The lines he had drawn and the light she had captured had merged perfectly, creating a frame strong enough to hold all their tomorrows. The great, booming, relentless city of San Francisco, the city that demanded both progress and memory, had finally yielded its heart to the architect and the photographer, who learned to love not despite their differences, but because of them. And as the last of the sun bled into the horizon, casting the city in hues of apricot and lavender, Benjamin tightened his embrace, knowing that his greatest design would always be the quiet, steady partnership he had built brick by emotional brick with Clara Shaw. Thank you for watching Old Heart Stories. Please subscribe for more stories from the past.